The beginning. Faith is born. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the world rests in stillness, we begin our journey through time. Traveling back 14 centuries to the birthplace of a faith that would transform the world. And at the very heart of this transformation stood remarkable women. Women whose strength, wisdom, and unwavering belief became the foundation upon which an entire civilization would rise. Our first figure is Khadija bint Khuwaylid. A name that echoes through history with reverence and love. Khadija was not simply the first wife of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. She was the first believer. Imagine the weight of that moment. When revelation first descended in the cave of Hira, and the Prophet returned home, trembling, uncertain, overwhelmed by what he had experienced. It was Khadija who wrapped him in her arms and spoke words of comfort and conviction. It was Khadija who said, without hesitation, "I believe you." Before there were mosques, before there were communities of believers, before Islam had a name recognized across Arabia, there was Khadija's faith. A successful merchant in her own right, a woman of wealth and status in Meccan society, she gave everything, her resources, her social standing, her very safety, to support the message of Islam in its most vulnerable, fragile days. For 25 years, she stood beside the Prophet as his partner, his confidant, his pillar of strength. She bore the ridicule of their society, the economic boycott that left the early Muslims hungry and isolated. And through it all, her faith never wavered. When we speak of Islam's earliest days, we cannot separate them from Khadija, for she was the backbone that held firm when everything else threatened to collapse. From Khadija's strength emerged another luminary, Fatimah bint Muhammad, the beloved daughter of the Prophet, peace be upon him. Born into a world that often devalued daughters, Fatimah became a symbol of purity, devotion, and the sacred continuation of prophetic lineage. The Prophet would stand when she entered a room, a gesture of profound respect that taught the early Muslim community how daughters should be honored. Fatimah witnessed the struggles of early Islam firsthand. She saw her father mocked and attacked. She helped wash blood from his face after he was assaulted while praying. Yet these hardships refined her spirit like gold purified in fire. She married Ali ibn Abi Talib, the Prophet's cousin, and from their union came Hassan and Hussein, the Prophet's grandsons, through whom his lineage would continue. But Fatimah was more than a link in a chain. She was a woman of deep spirituality, known for her long nights in prayer, her compassion for the poor, her strength in the face of adversity. Her life, though brief, left an indelible mark on Islamic consciousness. She represents the dignity of womanhood in Islam, the value of family, the power of faith, and the legacy that passes from one generation to the next. Voices that preserved Islam. As Islam spread beyond Mecca and Medina, as the Muslim community grew from a handful of believers to a nation, there arose a profound need, the need to preserve, to document, to understand the intricate details of faith and law. And once again, it was women who stepped forward to fulfill this sacred trust. Aisha bint Abi Bakr, daughter of the Prophet's closest companion, became one of Islam's greatest scholars. Married to the Prophet in her youth, she spent years absorbing his teachings, observing his character, learning the nuances of Islamic practice. But Aisha's brilliance truly shone after the Prophet's passing. She became a teacher, a reference point for thousands of questions about faith, law, and the Prophet's example. Imagine the scene, scholars and companions traveling to her home, sitting before her, seeking knowledge. Her memory was extraordinary. She narrated over 2,000 hadith, sayings and actions of the Prophet that would become foundational to Islamic jurisprudence. But Aisha was not simply a recorder of information. She was analytical, questioning, critically examining the reliability of reports that came to her. She corrected misunderstandings, clarified confusing matters, and engaged in scholarly debates with the leading minds of her time. In an era when women's intellectual contributions were often overlooked, Aisha commanded respect and authority. Her sharp mind shaped Islamic law and history in ways that continue to resonate today. Every time a Muslim seeks guidance on prayer, marriage, business ethics, or personal conduct, they may well be benefiting from knowledge preserved and transmitted by Aisha. Alongside Aisha stood Salama, whose birth name was Bint Abi Umayyah. Where Aisha brought scholarly precision, Salama brought profound wisdom and emotional intelligence. She was among the earliest converts to Islam, enduring persecution in Mecca, making the dangerous migration to Abyssinia, and later to Medina. Her life was marked by loss and resilience. She lost her first husband, Ummu Salama, leaving her a widow with children to raise. When she later married the Prophet, she brought to that union a mature perspective, a depth of life experience that made her counsel invaluable. History records a pivotal moment, the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, when the Prophet and the Muslims had traveled to Mecca hoping to perform pilgrimage, only to be turned away. A treaty was negotiated, but its terms seemed unfavorable, and the Muslims were disheartened, reluctant to follow the Prophet's instruction to make sacrifice and return home. It was Salama who advised the Prophet. "Go out and do it yourself first," she said, "and they will follow." Her insight proved true. When the Prophet acted, the companions followed, and what seemed like defeat became the foundation for Islam's peaceful expansion. This was Salama, the wise counselor whose understanding of human nature helped navigate critical decisions. And then there was Hafsa bint Umar, daughter of Umar ibn al-Khattab, the second caliph. Hafsa's place in history is secured by an awesome responsibility. She was entrusted with the written compilation of the Quran itself. After the Prophet's death, when the Muslims realized that the Quran needed to be preserved in written form before those who had memorized it passed away, the task fell to Zayd ibn Thabit under the Caliph Abu Bakr's direction. This precious manuscript was kept by Hafsa, the guardian of God's final revelation to humanity. 4 years, the official codex of the Quran remained in her safe keeping, a trust that required absolute integrity, vigilance, and honor. When the third caliph, Uthman, standardized the Quranic text and distributed copies throughout the Muslim lands, it was Hafsa's manuscript that served as the source. Think of the weight of that responsibility. The very words that would guide billions of people across centuries, preserved under her watch. Hafsa was also a scholar in her own right, narrating numerous hadith, but her role as guardian of the Quran itself places her in a unique position in Islamic history, a woman entrusted with humanity's most sacred text. These 5 women, Khadija, Fatimah, Aisha, Salama, and Hafsa, represent the foundation. They were there at the beginning, when faith was born. They preserved and protected what mattered most. And their legacy continues to inspire, reminding us that the greatest accomplishments of any civilization rest not just on those who lead armies or build empires, but on those who nurture faith, preserve knowledge, and pass wisdom from one generation to the next. As we pause here, let their stories settle gently into your thoughts, like whispers from history, reminding us of strength, faith, and the enduring power of women who shaped the world. Hearts of devotion. As centuries passed and Islam spread across vast lands, from the deserts of Arabia to the gardens of Persia, from the shores of North Africa to the mountains of Central Asia, the faith evolved, deepened, branched into streams of thought and practice. And in the city of Basra, in what is now Iraq, during the 8th century, there lived a woman whose spiritual legacy would transcend time itself. Her name was Rābiʿa al-ʿAdawiyya, and she would transform the very understanding of what it means to love God. Rābiʿa was born into poverty. Some accounts say she was sold into slavery as a child. Her early life was marked by hardship, by the kind of suffering that breaks some souls and refines others. Rābiʿa was refined. At some point in her youth, she was freed, and she chose a life of complete devotion, withdrawing from the world's distractions, living simply, spending her nights in prayer and contemplation. But what made Rābiʿa extraordinary was not the intensity of her worship alone. It was the purity of her intention, the revolutionary nature of her spiritual philosophy. In her time, Many people worshipped God out of fear of hellfire or hope for paradise. They prayed to avoid punishment, fasted to earn reward. Their devotion was transactional, service in exchange for safety, worship in exchange for paradise. Rābiʿa looked at this and saw something incomplete. She asked a question that echoed through the centuries. What if we loved God not for what we might gain or lose, but simply because God is worthy of love? Imagine that shift, from fear to love, from transaction to devotion, from seeking reward to seeking only the beloved. There's a famous story told about Rābiʿa. She was seen walking through the streets of Basra carrying a torch in one hand and a bucket of water in the other. When people asked what she was doing, she replied, "I want to set fire to paradise and pour water on hell so that both veils disappear and God's servants worship Him without hope of reward or fear of punishment, but simply out of love." Whether this event literally happened or is a teaching story matters less than its profound message. Rābiʿa was saying, strip away everything external, every calculation, every bargain we try to make with the divine, and what remains? Love. Pure, uncomplicated, selfless love. She would pray, "O God, if I worship you for fear of hell, burn me in hell. If I worship you in hope of paradise, exclude me from paradise. But if I worship you for your own sake, then do not withhold from me your eternal beauty." This was radical theology. This was the birth of Sufism's emphasis on divine love, on the intimate, personal relationship between the soul and God. Rābiʿa never married, though proposals came from respected scholars. She chose instead a marriage of the spirit, her entire life devoted to the presence of God. When people asked if she hated Satan, she replied, "My love for God leaves no room for hating anyone." Her poems and sayings were preserved, passed down through generations, studied and cherished by seekers of every era. Rābiʿa al-ʿAdawiyya showed the world that devotion could be an end in itself, that the ultimate goal of faith is not reward or safety, but union with the divine. In the quiet of night, in the solitude of prayer, she found what she sought, and in finding it, she lit a path that countless souls would follow for centuries to come. Women who stood in battle. But spirituality and contemplation were not the only arenas where Muslim women left their mark. When the early Muslim community faced existential threats, when armies gathered to crush this new faith before it could take root, women did not merely watch from the sidelines. They stepped forward, not just as supporters, but as active participants, defenders, warriors when necessary. And their courage became legendary. The Battle of Uhud, in the year 625. The Muslim community in Medina faced a Meccan army determined to destroy them. The battle was fierce, chaotic. At one critical moment, the Muslim lines broke, and enemy fighters pushed through, heading directly toward the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. In that moment of supreme danger, when everything hung in the balance, a woman stepped forward to shield him. Her name was Nusayba bint Ka'b, known as Ammarah. She was not a soldier by training. She had come to the battlefield initially to provide water to the wounded. But when she saw the Prophet in danger, surrounded by enemies, she didn't hesitate. She picked up a sword and shield and fought with a ferocity that stunned those who witnessed it. Accounts tell us she received multiple wounds that day, some say 12 or 13 injuries, defending the Prophet with her own body. She sustained a deep shoulder wound that took a year to heal. The Prophet himself noticed her courage, later saying that wherever he turned during that difficult moment, he saw her fighting on his behalf. This was not an isolated act. Nusayba participated in multiple battles, including the Battle of Yamama, where she lost her hand. She lived through the Prophet's era and into the caliphate of Abu Bakr and Umar, honored and respected for her sacrifice. Nusayba bint Ka'b shattered any notion that courage and sacrifice were solely male domains. She showed that when faith and community are threatened, women stand as firmly as men and fight with equal valor. But not all battlefield contributions came through combat. Some came through healing, through mercy, through the desperate work of saving lives amid chaos and blood. Rufaydah al-Ansariyyah was a woman of Medina, from the Ansar, those who welcomed and supported the Muslim immigrants from Mecca. Rufaydah had learned medical skills, the treatment of wounds, the care of the sick and injured. When battles occurred, she established what we might today call a field hospital, a medical tent where casualties could be brought, where wounds could be cleaned and bandaged, where the dying could be comforted. She trained other women in these skills, creating the first organized medical corps in Islamic history. After the Battle of Khandaq, the Prophet himself was brought to her tent for treatment of his injuries. Think about that. The first Muslim nurse, working in the 7th century, organizing emergency medical care, training others, establishing protocols for triage and treatment. Rufaydah understood something profound, that preserving life is as noble as defending it, that mercy and healing are forms of jihad, struggle in God's path. Her legacy extended beyond the battlefield. She cared for the poor and sick in Medina during peacetime, running what amounted to a community health clinic. She received no payment for this work. It was service, pure and simple. The Prophet recognized her contributions, ensuring she received a share from the spoils of war equivalent to that of a soldier, acknowledging that her work saving lives was as crucial as any military role. Rufaydah al-Ansariyyah pioneered a tradition that continues today. Muslim women in medicine, in nursing, in healthcare, carrying forward her legacy of compassionate, skilled, life-saving care. And then there was Khadija bint al-Aswar, a warrior whose very name became synonymous with courage on the battlefield. Khadija was a contemporary of the early Islamic conquests, the rapid expansion of Muslim territory in the decades following the Prophet's death. She came from a family of fighters. Her brother, Durar ibn al-Aswar, was a renowned warrior. But Khadija matched or exceeded his reputation. Accounts describe her fighting in the Battle of Ajnadayn and the Battle of Yarmouk, major conflicts against the Byzantine Empire. What made Khadija remarkable was not just that she fought, but how she fought and the impact she had. In one famous account, during a battle when Muslim forces were struggling, a mysterious warrior appeared, clad in black armor, face covered, fighting with extraordinary skill and ferocity, rallying the Muslim troops and turning the tide of battle. After the victory, this unknown warrior was revealed to be Khadija bint al-Aswar. She had disguised herself, knowing that her presence might cause hesitation among some who questioned women's battlefield roles, but her skill was undeniable. In another account, when her brother Durar was captured by Byzantine forces, Khadija led a rescue mission to free him, fighting her way through enemy lines. Whether every detail of these stories is historically verifiable matters less than what they represent. Khadija became a symbol, a reminder that Muslim women could be warriors when necessary, that physical courage and martial skill were not exclusively male attributes. Her legacy inspired generations. During moments when Muslim lands faced invasion or occupation, the memory of Khadija bint al-Aswar was invoked, a rallying cry, a reminder that defense of faith and community transcends gender. These four women, Rābiʿa with her pure spiritual devotion, Nusayba with her protective courage, Rufaydah with her healing mercy, and Khadija with her warrior spirit, show us the breadth and depth of women's contributions to Islam. From the interior life of prayer to the chaos of the battlefield, from mystical love to physical courage, from healing hands to the warrior's sword, women shaped every dimension of Islamic civilization. As this segment draws to a close, let these stories rest in your mind, like stars in the night sky, each shining with its own light, together illuminating the vast expanse of human potential and faith. Builders of knowledge. As Islamic civilization flourished, as cities rose from desert sands and knowledge flowed like rivers from east to west, there emerged great centers of learning, places where the wisdom of ancient civilizations was preserved, translated, debated, and built upon. Libraries filled with manuscripts, schools where students gathered to learn medicine, mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, and sacred sciences. And at the heart of this intellectual revolution, standing as pillars of scholarship and education, were women whose contributions shaped the very foundation of learning itself. In the city of Fez, Morocco, in the year 859, a woman named Fatimah al-Fariyah did something extraordinary. She was the daughter of a wealthy merchant who had migrated from Tunisia to Morocco, and when her father passed away, she inherited considerable wealth. But Fatima looked at her inheritance and asked herself a profound question: what is the most lasting good I can do with this? Many would have chosen comfort, security, perhaps charitable donations that would be quickly spent and forgotten. Fatima chose differently. She chose to build something that would outlast her by more than a millennium. She founded al-Qarawiyya, not just a mosque, but an educational institution, a place of learning that would grow into one of the world's first degree-granting universities. Let that sink in for a moment. In the 9th century, when much of Europe was in the depths of the medieval period, a Muslim woman in North Africa was founding a university. Al-Qarawiyya became a beacon. Scholars traveled from across the Islamic world to study there. Its library held priceless manuscripts. Its lecture halls echoed with debates on theology, law, philosophy, mathematics. Students who studied there went on to become great scholars themselves, spreading knowledge across continents. The curriculum included religious sciences, of course, but also grammar, rhetoric, logic, medicine, astronomy, geography, history. This was education in its fullest sense, the cultivation of the complete human mind and spirit. And it all began with Fatimah al-Fariyah's vision and generosity. The Guinness Book of World Records recognizes al-Qarawiyya as the oldest existing, continually operating educational institution in the world. To this day, more than 11 centuries later, it still functions as a university. Students still walk its courtyards, still sit in its lecture halls, still benefit from the vision of a woman who understood that true wealth lies not in what we accumulate, but in what we give that continues to bear fruit long after we're gone. But building institutions was only one way women contributed to Islamic scholarship. Perhaps even more importantly, they served as the transmitters, the preservers, the authorities on the very foundations of Islamic knowledge itself. In the city of Marw, in what is now Turkmenistan, during the 11th century, there lived a woman named Karima al-Marwaziyya. Her name might not be widely known today, but among scholars of hadith, the sayings and actions of the Prophet Muhammad that form the basis of Islamic law and practice, her name is legendary. Karima was a muhadditha, a scholar and transmitter of hadith. She studied under the greatest scholars of her time, memorizing thousands upon thousands of prophetic traditions, learning not just the words but the chains of transmission, the science of evaluating reliability, the nuanced art of hadith criticism. What made Karima particularly special was her mastery of Sahih al-Bukhari, one of the two most authentic collections of hadith in Sunni Islam. She became the world's foremost authority on this text. When scholars wanted to verify their copies of Bukhari, when they wanted to check if they had transmitted a hadith correctly, they came to Karima. She lived a very long life, into her 90s, and for decades she was the link, the connection between past and present. Great scholars, men who would themselves become famous authorities, sat before her as students, receiving certification from her in the study of Bukhari. The historian al-Dahabi, writing about her, said she was the most reliable narrator of Bukhari in her time. Think about that. In a field dominated by men, in an era we often imagine excluded women from scholarship, here was a woman whose authority was unquestioned, whose knowledge was sought by the greatest minds of the Islamic world. Karima al-Marwaziyya represents thousands of women scholars whose names fill the biographical dictionaries of Islamic learning, women who preserved and transmitted the foundational texts of Islam, ensuring that knowledge passed accurately from one generation to the next. And this tradition of female scholarship continued across centuries. In Damascus, in the 14th century, lived Zainab bint al-Kamal, a woman who taught scholars across generations, whose influence rippled through Islamic intellectual history in ways both visible and invisible. Zainab was born into a scholarly family. Her father was a renowned scholar, and she grew up immersed in books, lectures, debates, the vibrant intellectual culture of medieval Damascus. She studied hadith, Islamic law, Arabic grammar, and she didn't just study, she mastered these fields. What's remarkable about Zainab is the sheer number of students she taught. Historical records show that she gave ijazas, certifications authorizing students to transmit knowledge, to hundreds of scholars. Among her students were some of the most famous names in Islamic scholarship, including the great historian Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, who studied under her when he was a young man. Imagine the scene. Damascus in the 1300s, the city's many madrasas and mosques bustling with students, and in one of these scholarly circles sits an elderly woman, Zainab, surrounded by eager learners, men and women, young and old, all there to receive knowledge from her, to connect their chain of learning back through her to the Prophet himself. This was not unusual. Historical research has uncovered that in medieval Islamic societies, it was common for women to be scholars and teachers. Some studies suggest that as many as 15% of the scholars in some medieval Islamic cities were women. They taught in mosques, in private homes, in madrasas. They wrote books, they issued legal opinions, they participated in scholarly debates. Zainab bint al-Kamal was one of thousands, but she represents them all, these women who understood that knowledge is a sacred trust, something to be preserved, transmitted, and shared generously with all who seek it. Women who ruled. Knowledge and scholarship were not the only arenas where Muslim women exercised power and influence. Despite cultural restrictions that often limited women's public roles, throughout Islamic history there emerged remarkable women who didn't just influence rulers. They were rulers themselves, wielding political and military authority, making decisions that shaped nations and changed the course of history. In the mountains of Yemen, during the 11th century, there ruled a woman whose intelligence and political skill made her one of the most effective sovereigns of her age. Her name was Arwa al-Sulayhi, though she was known by an even more impressive title, al-Malika al-Hura, the noble queen, or the free queen. Arwa was not born to power. She was orphaned young and raised in the court of the Sulayhi dynasty. But she received an extraordinary education, politics, administration, Islamic law, theology. She married the Sultan Ahmad al-Mukarram, and when he became ill and unable to rule, it was Arwa who took the reins of government. And she didn't just maintain what existed, she transformed it. Arwa ruled Yemen for over 40 years, from the late 11th century into the 12th. During her reign, Yemen experienced stability and prosperity. She was a skilled diplomat, navigating complex relationships with neighboring powers, with a Fatimid caliphate in Egypt, with various tribal factions within Yemen itself. She moved the capital from Sana'a to Jibla, a city she developed and beautified. She built mosques, schools, reservoirs, roads, infrastructure that improved people's lives and facilitated commerce. She was also deeply religious, a scholar in her own right, issuing religious edicts, supporting the Ismaili branch of Shia Islam to which she belonged. What's striking about Arwa is that her authority was not merely ceremonial. She commanded armies, she appointed governors, she made strategic decisions in times of war and peace. The Friday sermon, the khutbah given in mosques across her realm, was delivered in her name, a public acknowledgement of her sovereignty. When historians wrote about her, they praised her wisdom, her justice, her administrative competence. She wasn't accepted as a ruler despite being a woman. She was recognized as a great ruler, period. Arwa al-Sulayhi proves that when given the opportunity, when circumstances allowed, Muslim women could exercise supreme political authority with skill and success. Far to the north, in Egypt, another woman was wielding power in the shadows and in the light of the Fatimid state. Her name was Sitt al-Mulk, which means Lady of Power, and the name was fitting. She was the sister of the Fatimid Caliph al-Hakim, a controversial and erratic ruler whose reign was marked by increasingly bizarre edicts and violent paranoia. When al-Hakim mysteriously disappeared in 1021, some say Sitt al-Mulk had him killed to save the state from his destructive rule. She became the de facto ruler of the Fatimid Caliphate. Her nephew, al-Zahir, was officially caliph, but he was young, and real power rested with Sitt al-Mulk. She was a masterful political operator. She stabilized a state that had been thrown into chaos by her brother's erratic policies. She negotiated with military commanders, with religious authorities, with foreign powers. She managed the economy, the administration, the delicate balance of power between competing factions. What's fascinating about Sitt al-Mulk is how she navigated the contradiction of being a woman in power in a society that officially limited women's public roles. She never claimed the title of caliph. That would have been unacceptable. But she didn't need the title. She had the substance of power. Court officials came to her for decisions. Her signature appeared on state documents. When she died in 1023, after just 2 years of effective rule, it was said that the state had lost its guiding intelligence. Sitt al-Mulk represents a pattern seen throughout Islamic history: women who wielded power indirectly, through family connections, through intelligence and political skill, shaping events from positions that official doctrine said they shouldn't occupy, but which practical necessity and their own capabilities made inevitable. And then there was Rābiʿa Sultan, who went further than any of these women, who claimed not just the reality of power but the title itself. In the Delhi Sultanate of 13th century India, Sultan Iltutmish faced a dilemma. He had several sons, but none impressed him as capable rulers. He had a daughter, Rābiʿa, who from childhood had shown intelligence, administrative skill, and leadership ability. On his deathbed, he bypassed his sons and named Rābiʿa as his successor. The nobles resisted. They placed one of her brothers on the throne instead. But he proved incompetent, and in 1236, Rābiʿa seized power. She didn't call herself Sultana, the feminine form. She insisted on being called Sultan, the same title as any male ruler. She appeared in public without a veil, wearing male clothing more suited to riding and governance. She held court, issued orders, led armies into battle. For 4 years, Rābiʿa ruled the Delhi Sultanate with competence and authority. She appointed officials based on merit rather than noble birth, which angered the aristocracy. She promoted a former slave, Jamal-ud-Din Yaqut, to high position based on his abilities, which scandalized conservative nobles who used this to undermine her. Eventually, rebellion and intrigue brought her down. She was killed in 1240, her reign cut short by those who could not accept a woman's rule. But Rābiʿa Sultan's significance isn't in how long she ruled, but in what she dared to claim. She didn't accept power behind the scenes. She claimed it openly, insisted on the full title and prerogatives of a sultan. She ruled not as a woman in a man's world, but as a ruler, full stop. Her courage and her tragedy both became legendary, remembered in histories, celebrated in poetry, a reminder that Muslim women have claimed every form of power and authority, even when society resisted, even when it cost them everything. These 6 women: Fatimah, who built a university, Karima who preserved prophetic wisdom, Zainab who taught generations, Arwa who ruled with wisdom, Sit al-Mulk who wielded power behind the throne, and Razia who claimed the throne itself. They show us that Muslim women's contributions to civilization were not confined to the domestic sphere, were not limited to supporting roles. They were builders, scholars, teachers, and rulers, shaping the intellectual, political, and social landscape of Islamic civilization in ways that continue to resonate today. As these stories settle into the quiet spaces of your mind, let them rest there, like seeds planted in fertile ground, waiting to bloom into understanding, appreciation, and inspiration. Power, strategy, and survival. Throughout history, power has rarely been given freely. It must be claimed, defended, sometimes seized in moments of crisis when the alternative is chaos or collapse. And in the tumultuous world of medieval politics, where dynasties rose and fell, where assassination and intrigue were tools of statecraft, there emerged women who understood that survival itself required strength, strategy, and the willingness to do what others thought impossible. In Egypt, in the year 1249, the Ayyubid Sultan al-Salih Ayyub died at a moment of supreme danger. The Seventh Crusade was underway. French King Louis IX had invaded Egypt with a formidable army, and Muslim forces were locked in desperate combat. If news of the Sultan's death became public at that moment, the army might collapse, the state might fracture, everything might be lost. Someone had to act decisively, had to hold things together until the crisis passed. That someone was Shajar al-Durr, a woman whose life story reads like an epic tale of transformation and will. Shajar al-Durr had been enslaved, brought to the Sultan's household, eventually becoming his favored wife. But she was no mere consort. She was intelligent, politically astute, a woman who understood power and how to wield it. When the Sultan died, she concealed his death, forging his signature on orders, maintaining the fiction that he still lived and commanded. Under this deception, the Egyptian forces rallied, defeated the Crusaders, and captured King Louis himself. Only after victory was secured did Shajar al-Durr reveal the truth. The Sultan's son, Turan Shah, was summoned to take the throne, but he proved ungrateful, arrogant, threatening to remove all those who had held power during his father's reign. The Mamluk military commanders, feeling threatened, assassinated him. And then came the unprecedented decision. They proclaimed Shajar al-Durr as Sultana of Egypt. A woman, ruling in her own name, with her own authority. Coins were minted bearing her name and titles. The Friday sermon was recited in her name. For 80 days, Shajar al-Durr was the sovereign of Egypt. But the Abbasid caliph in Baghdad was scandalized, reportedly saying, "If you have no men to rule you, tell us and we will send you one." Under pressure, facing resistance from traditionalists who could not accept female rule, Shajar al-Durr made a strategic decision. She married Ibak, the Mamluk commander, and formally ceded the sultanate to him. But those who knew understood. She remained the power behind the throne, the strategic mind guiding Egypt's policies. For 7 years this arrangement held, until jealousy and palace intrigue turned deadly. When Ibak planned to take another wife, threatening Shajar al-Durr's position, she had him killed. But she had overplayed her hand. Ibak's supporters seized her, and she was beaten to death by his first wife's servants in 1257. Shajar al-Durr's story is tragedy and triumph intertwined, a woman who rose from slavery to sovereignty, who saved Egypt at its moment of greatest peril, who wielded power with skill and ruthlessness, and who ultimately fell victim to the very violent politics she had mastered. Her legacy endures. She changed history, proved that women could rule, and established the Mamluk dynasty that would govern Egypt for centuries. In that same era, but in a different corner of the Islamic world, another woman was building a different kind of power, not through warfare and political intrigue, but through institutions, knowledge, and patronage. In Damascus, During the 13th century, a woman named Rābiʿa Khatun, known as Sit al-Sham, Lady of Damascus, used her wealth and influence to leave a lasting mark on her city. Rābiʿa came from a prominent family and married into wealth and power. Her husband was an important official in the Ayyubid administration. But what distinguished Rābiʿa was what she chose to do with her resources. She became a great builder and patron, establishing madrasas, schools where students could study Islamic sciences, law, theology, hadith. Education in the medieval Islamic world often depended on such patronage, wealthy individuals funding institutions that would operate in perpetuity, providing free education to students who might otherwise have no access to learning. The madrasas Rābiʿa built in Damascus became renowned centers of scholarship. She also built ribats, establishments that served multiple purposes, including housing for travelers, retreats for scholars and Sufis, and defensive fortifications. She constructed caravanserais, rest stops along trade routes where merchants could find shelter and safety. These weren't vanity projects, they were infrastructure, the kind of building that makes civilization possible, that facilitates commerce, education, spiritual life. What's remarkable is that Rābiʿa Khatun's buildings still stand. You can visit Damascus today and see structures she commissioned over 7 centuries ago, still bearing inscriptions with her name, still testifying to her vision and generosity. She understood something profound, that buildings outlast people, that institutions preserve knowledge across generations, that the most lasting power comes not from commanding armies but from creating places where minds are shaped and knowledge is preserved. Rābiʿa Khatun was a protector of knowledge, and in a world where libraries burned, where wars destroyed, where ignorance constantly threatened to overwhelm learning, such protectors were as essential as any warrior or ruler. Islam beyond Arabia. As Islam spread beyond its Arabian birthplace, it encountered diverse cultures, civilizations, and traditions. And in these encounters, something beautiful happened. Islam was not imposed uniformly, but rather adapted, took on local colors and flavors, produced leaders and scholars who reflected their own cultural contexts while remaining connected to the broader Islamic world. In Africa and Southeast Asia particularly, Muslim women rose to positions of extraordinary authority and influence. In West Africa, in what is now northern Nigeria, during the 16th century, there ruled a queen whose name became legendary, Amina of Zaza. The Hausa kingdoms of that era were powerful trading states, controlling valuable commerce routes across the Sahara. Amina was born a princess in Zaza, and from youth she was trained not in domestic arts alone, but in warfare and statecraft. When her brother died, she became queen, and she proved to be a military genius and expansionist ruler. For 34 years, Queen Amina led military campaigns, expanding Zaza's territory, establishing new trade routes, building walled fortifications around cities, walls that became known as Amina's Walls, some of which still exist today. She commanded armies personally, riding at the head of her troops, feared and respected by enemies and allies alike. Under her rule, Zaza became the most powerful Hausa state, controlling trade in salt, cloth, kola nuts, and slaves across a vast region. But Amina was not merely a conqueror. She was an administrator who organized her expanded territories, ensuring they functioned as a coherent state rather than a collection of conquered lands. Her legacy in West African history is immense. She's remembered in songs, stories, and oral traditions as a warrior queen, a symbol of female power and capability. What's particularly significant is that Amina was a Muslim ruler in a region where Islam had been established for centuries, where it coexisted with indigenous African traditions and adapted to local contexts. She represents the Africanization of Islam, the way the faith became deeply rooted in African societies, producing leaders and civilizations that were distinctly African and distinctly Islamic simultaneously. Amina of Zaza reminds us that Islamic civilization was never monolithic, never confined to the Middle East or Arabia. It was a global phenomenon, and African Muslim women were among its most powerful and influential figures. Thousands of miles to the east, in the Sultanate of Aceh on the northern tip of Sumatra in what is now Indonesia, another remarkable Muslim woman was ruling, but in a very different context and style. Her name was Sultana Safiyyatuddin Tajul Alam, and she became the first of 4 successive female rulers of Aceh in the 17th century. Aceh was a wealthy, powerful maritime state, controlling crucial trade routes between the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea, dealing in spices, silk, and other valuable commodities. When Sultan Iskandar Muda died in 1641, his widow Safiyyatuddin was chosen to succeed him. Her reign, which lasted from 1641 to 1675, was marked by relative peace and prosperity, a welcome change after decades of aggressive military expansion under previous male rulers. But what truly distinguished Safiyyatuddin was her patronage of scholars and learning. She invited Islamic scholars from across the Muslim world to her court, from Arabia, from India, from other parts of Southeast Asia. Aceh under her rule became a center of Islamic scholarship, particularly in Sufism, Islamic mysticism. Great religious debates took place at her court, discussions about the nature of God, about the proper practice of Islam, about the balance between outer religious law and inner spiritual experience. She corresponded with other Muslim rulers, maintained diplomatic relations, and ensured that Aceh remained connected to the broader Islamic world. European traders and travelers who visited Aceh during her reign left accounts expressing surprise that a woman could rule so effectively, but also admiration for the orderliness and prosperity they found. Safiyyatuddin's legacy challenges stereotypes. She ruled a Muslim state, in a region where Islam had only arrived centuries earlier through peaceful trade and Sufi missionaries, and she did so with wisdom, stability, and a commitment to learning. She represents the Southeast Asian Islamic tradition, sophisticated, cosmopolitan, deeply spiritual, and surprisingly egalitarian in certain respects, including the acceptance of female rulers that would have been controversial in some other parts of the Muslim world. The legacy continues. As we near the end of our journey through these remarkable lives, we come to a woman whose story bridges the historical and the modern, whose work laid foundations that continue to bear fruit today. In the 19th century, in the Sokoto Caliphate of what is now northern Nigeria, there lived a woman named Nana Asma'u. She was born in 1793, daughter of Usman Dan Fodio, the founder of the Sokoto Caliphate and leader of a major Islamic reform movement in West Africa. Nana Asma'u grew up in an environment of intense intellectual and religious activity. Her father believed strongly in education for all, including women, and Asma'u received an extraordinary education for her time. She mastered Arabic, Fulfulde, Hausa, and Tamashek languages. She studied the Quran, Hadith, Islamic law, history, and poetry. But Nana Asma'u didn't simply acquire knowledge for herself. She became an educator, a teacher, an architect of vast knowledge networks that transformed women's education across the Sokoto Caliphate. She wrote extensively, poems, historical accounts, religious instruction manuals. But she wrote in multiple languages, understanding that knowledge must be accessible to be useful. She composed poetry in Arabic for scholars, but also in Fulfulde and Hausa for common people, especially women who might not read Arabic. Her poems served as teaching tools, easy to memorize verses that conveyed Islamic knowledge, moral instruction, historical lessons. Some of her works celebrated women's achievements, including poems honoring women who participated in her father's jihad, ensuring their contributions were remembered. But Nana Asma'u's greatest achievement was the system she created for women's education. She established a network of women teachers called Jajis, educated women who would travel to rural areas, to villages and nomadic camps, teaching other women to read, instructing them in Islamic principles, spreading knowledge far beyond the urban centers where education was traditionally concentrated. This was revolutionary, a systematic, organized effort to educate women across a vast territory, reaching into communities that formal institutions could never touch. The Jajis would stay with communities for periods of time, teaching, then move on, creating a ripple effect of knowledge spreading outward. Women who learned from the Jajis might become teachers themselves, continuing the cycle. This system operated for decades, survived Nana Asma'u's death in 1864, and influenced educational practices in the region for generations. What makes Nana Asma'u's legacy particularly powerful is its modern relevance. In recent decades, as scholars have rediscovered and studied her work, she's become an inspiration for Muslim women's education movements worldwide. Organizations promoting female literacy and education in Muslim communities look to Nana Asma'u as a model, proof that Islam, properly understood, demands education for women, that Muslim women have a long history as educators and scholars. Her collected works have been translated, studied, celebrated. Schools and organizations have been named after her. She represents a living legacy, not just a historical figure we admire from a distance, but someone whose methods and vision continue to inspire practical action today. And with Nana Asma'u, we complete our journey, from Khadija's faith in the earliest days of Islam, through centuries of scholars, warriors, rulers, and educators, to Nana Asma'u's educational networks in 19th century West Africa. 20 remarkable women, yet they represent thousands, tens of thousands, countless Muslim women across 14 centuries who contributed to Islamic civilization in ways both visible and hidden. They were the first believers and the transmitters of knowledge. They defended the faith with swords and preserved it with books. They ruled nations and taught students. They built universities and led armies. They composed mystical poetry and organized educational systems. They were African and Arab, Persian and Turkish, South Asian and Southeast Asian, reflecting Islam's global reach and diverse expressions. These women remind us that history is richer and more complex than we often imagine, that women's contributions to civilization, to faith, to knowledge and power have always been present even when overlooked or forgotten. They challenge simplistic narratives about Muslim women, about Islam, about history itself. And perhaps most importantly, they inspire, showing what's possible when talent meets opportunity, when faith meets courage, when vision meets determination. As you drift towards sleep, let these stories accompany you. 20 lights in the darkness, 20 voices across time, 20 witnesses to the power, wisdom, courage, and faith of Muslim women throughout history. May their legacy continue to inspire, to educate, to remind us of the heights human beings can reach when given the opportunity to fulfill their potential. Rest now, and let history's whispers become dreams.